There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Vladimir Lenin, circa 1920. This quote rings true, and with what we just witnessed in Syria, where after 13 years of relentless Atlanticist pressure, the Assad government collapsed like a deck of cards, despite having stood its ground and holding out in the face of Atlanticist imperialism. American and Turkish proxy insurgents, Israeli airstrikes, crippling sanctions, internal corruption, and media disinformation capturing the minds of the people and convincing them to act against their own best interests. The Syrian state could not continue. So after 53 years, the Assad government collapsed overnight, leaving a power vacuum which has been usurped by rebranded Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorist groups known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, abbreviated to HTS. Syria is now ruled by Salafi extremists that are still on the terrorist watch list of Washington and have already begun purging the Syrian population of people they consider to be infidels, such as Shias, Alawites, and Christians, with massacres and public executions taking place in the regions under their control. A wave of terror has just been unleashed on Syria, which has been utterly destroyed as the vultures feed on its carcass, with the state being parceled out between Turkey, the USA, and Israel. So what happened? Why did the Syrian Arab army refuse to make a stand? Why did Assad abandon his country, throwing his people under the bus? This sudden collapse came as a shock, especially the speed at which it occurred. It was almost instantaneous, which suggests it was planned. It's clear that Assad had already decided to throw in the towel and made prior arrangements.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Syria had already been earmarked for regime change as far back as 1996. The plan was, once Saddam Hussein had been toppled in 2003, the US Army would then pivot west and head in the direction of Damascus to overthrow the Assad government. However, the chaos that followed caused the US military to get bogged down in Iraq for years. It wasn't until 2011, when the CIA and Mossad had successfully ignited the Arab Spring, that Syria became the subject of direct attacks, with the focus directed at toppling President Bashar al-Assad. But instead of a direct US military invasion, Washington used opposition groups and rebels as proxies, whom they had been arming, training, and providing logistical support to. Turkey and the Zionist occupation of Palestine, known as Israel, were also backing these insurgents. Using social media to capture the minds of many Syrians, the information space was wide open to subversion, and the enemies of Assad used this to maximum effect. Before long, there were jihadi extremists from all over Central Asia, Europe, and the Middle East confronting the Syrian state. ISIS and Al-Qaeda began conquering territory, putting the Syrian Arab army on the back foot and in danger of losing control entirely. It was only with Russian and Iranian intervention that the Assad government was saved, and the SAA was able to halt the advances of these terrorist groups, and by 2017, most of Syria had been liberated, with the exception of Idlib, where the jihadis had been forced back and bottled up in the northwest corner of Syria. Meanwhile, in the east and north, American-backed Kurdish independence forces had seized control, declaring their own autonomous region where all the oil fields were located, allowing for the US to loot them at leisure. By 2020, the war was effectively frozen when Russia, Iran, and Turkey signed an agreement in Astana where Ankara was forced to concede and stop enabling the terrorist groups whom they had been arming and providing support through a supply line from Gaziantep to Idlib. The Americans controlled the northeast by proxy and a segment of land on the Jordanian-Iraqi borders where they established Al-Tanf base, which was conveniently surrounded by other proxy jihadi militants that happened to be American-friendly. No prizes for guessing why this is. What happened next will make it obvious as to why the events of December 2024 unfolded the way they did, and in retrospect, it will come as no surprise. The leadership of the Syrian Arab Army was very corrupt and in desperate need of reform. The high-ranking officers abused their positions and enriched themselves at the expense of the common soldiers. Bashar himself was not in line to take his father's position after his death. That was reserved for his older brother, Bassel. However, he died in a car accident in 1994, leaving Bashar as the heir to his father's dynasty. And so, in 2000, when Hafez al-Assad died, Bashar inherited a corrupt, yet functioning state. Syria remained outside of American-Israeli hegemony, and thus was a designated enemy of the so-called free world. Although Syria is ancient, with the world's oldest human settlements, and Damascus being the oldest continuously inhabited city, the modern Syrian Republic is an artificial construct, a legacy of the dismembered Ottoman Empire, and nothing more than lines drawn on a map by Sykes and Picot, resulting in a pluralistic nation cobbled together by authoritarianism. There's an experiment where black and red ants are placed inside a jar and live together peacefully, that is, until the jar is shaken, causing them to fight and kill each other. Shia, Sunni, Alawite, Druze, Christian, Kurd, and others all formed modern-day Syria, and prior to this, these same people were part of the Ottoman Empire. They all lived together in peace for centuries, until the Zionists showed up and understood how to exploit their differences and create chaos. Now back to 2011, and the CIA-Mossad campaign to overthrow Bashar al-Assad is in full swing, both on the streets and in the information space where social media had just met the smartphone, amplifying its effects. The American and Israeli-sponsored terrorists began fighting the Syrian Arab army. Territory was taken and cities fell. Meanwhile, in the east, American-backed Kurdish forces carved out their own enclave. ISIS, an offshoot of al-Qaeda, then appeared out of Iraq in 2014, crossing over into Syria and rapidly gaining territory, and declared a caliphate, which was also in the east, where they clashed with Kurdish rebels and the SAA. By 2013, the Syrian army was already overwhelmed. Assad appealed to Russia and Iran for assistance, inviting them into Syria. Tehran and Moscow obliged and sent in significant military forces, effectively blunting all offensive maneuvers by the jihadis, and together with the SAA and Hezbollah were able to liberate much of Syria. By 2018, ISIS was destroyed. The Kurds held their self-declared autonomous enclave, and surviving jihadi terrorists were cornered in Idlib, where they had their own little caliphate, imposing Salafi extremism on the local population. Syria was saved, or so it seemed. Instead of destroying what was left of the terrorists, Damascus simply left them to incubate in Idlib, where they could easily be resupplied and built up again by Turkey. This conflict was effectively frozen, but the SAA failed to build any defensive positions along the line of contact. After the 2020 agreement in Astana, which formally ended Turkey's support for these terrorist groups, the Russians told Assad that he absolutely needed to reform his military and purge the corrupt officer class. Moscow also offered to fully modernize the SAA in preparation for a renewed conflict, which they understood was inevitable. But Assad could not bring himself to discipline the same generals in his army that just saved his nation, and so he refused Russian offers to transform the SAA into a modern fighting force. Likewise, Iran also made gestures to improve the SAA and to help secure Syria from future hostilities, but again, Assad refused. Syria was also under tremendous pressure from sanctions, which were strangling the country, causing hardship and strife within the population. Syria's natural resources of oil, grain, and phosphates were being looted, and none of the revenues were going to the people. The Americans were stealing everything. Iran was keeping Syria on life support with oil exports, along with other commodities. Dr. Bashar al-Assad, yes, he is a doctor, was accused of being an evil dictator who murdered his own people. This is absolutely false. If anything, he wasn't ruthless enough. He was also very naive, as he seemed to be easily seduced by the Gulf Arab countries. After 2020, it was clear that Assad had secured Syria and his government, which the CIA and Mossad had failed to topple. The Arab League, which he had been ejected from, was offering him readmission, something he seemed very keen on accepting. However, there were conditions, chiefly that he distance himself from Iran. Bashar obliged, thinking this was his path back to normalization, and perhaps even rapprochement with the USA. He was wrong. This was perhaps his biggest blunder, thinking he could trust those who only a few years earlier were trying to kill him. The Gulf Arab oil companies had also been funding all the terrorists coming into Syria through Turkey. This was nothing but a ruse to get him to take part in his own demise, which he did. It does seem, however, that Assad may have been planning his departure from Syria as far back as 2017, when he and his family began learning Russian. He also purchased property in Russia. It does appear odd that after 13 years of fending off his enemies, he simply abandoned ship, throwing his people under the bus with little to no warning. Was this an impulsive last-minute decision? No. Arrangements were made, and deals were cut. Orders were given to stand down. The Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah all scrambled to the aid of the SAA, but when it became apparent that they wouldn't fight, these would-be defenders of Syria could do nothing. They could assist, but they couldn't fight for the Syrian army. These HTS terrorists, numbering only 25,000, could easily have been destroyed, but the SAA was completely demoralized and unwilling to fight. Dr. Assad probably never wanted to be president. He stood up to American Zionist imperialism. He resisted their demands to kneel at their feet and submit, or remove himself to make way for someone who would. He kept Syria alive despite years of sanctions, terrorism, civil war, and internal strife. But he ruined his legacy by abandoning his own people, leaving them at the mercy of an army of bloodthirsty killers who execute people who don't recite the Quran correctly in their eyes. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please consider subscribing. Please also share and leave a like. It's free and it helps the channel. Also, a big thank you to all of you who have very kindly donated. I very much appreciate your generosity, as this channel is demonetized. For one-off donations, it's easy. I accept PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee, or even crypto. Links are in the description. Until next time.